Who am I? I am a very sensitive person, and I care a lot about people, and family is the most important thing to me, and I always try to have a positive attitude about everything, but it doesn't always work out. Why am I on Earth? Why am I here? I always thought that I had something like I can offer to people, you know, like, and especially lately I've been thinking about it a lot, like why, like what can I give back to people, and why, like what is my purpose here? And I feel like I can bring good, like as far as teaching and educating children, and like just helping them to be brought up with a good attitude, and to be compassionate. Honestly, when it comes to death, I don't know what to expect. I'm not sure what I believe. It's definitely changed a lot over the past couple years, my views, and as far as what I think happens. But as far as I'm concerned about like here and now, as far as like, I know that death is definitely going to be a change, whether it's going to be the end or there's going to be something else. But right now I just want to focus on living my life like to the fullest I can, which I know it sounds corny because everybody says that, but really, like do what I can, like take one day at a time, and just try to live the best life that I know how. As far as society allowing you to live an authentic life, like being able to do what you want all the time, I don't think it has bad intentions, but I think that American society it makes it easy for us to conform. It doesn't force us to, but I think it makes it sound so much better to just do this because you'll have an easier life, or whereas if you want to try to change things, or look into issues, or raise a point, or be different, you're gonna get beaten down, and so it's easier just to conform. Like the social pressures as far as like how you're expected to look, and a lot of times how you're expected to act. Like and carry yourself, like when you're out in public, or like the things you're expected to do, like you're supposed to be like nice and polite to everyone all the time, and always look good, even if like you're walking down the street and going to the grocery store. I feel like I'm constantly being judged and looked at for how I dress and everything. Spirituality for me, at this point in my life, like I said, I've been in different places before, and I'm sure what I've believed and what guides me, but at this point in my life, spirituality for me is just being at peace with myself, and waking up every day and just telling myself that I'm going to do the best that I can, and that I'm going to make mistakes, but that I'm in charge of my life. I'm in charge of the decisions that I'm going to make, and that's what I'm going to go with. Today I'm just going to take it one step at a time and just do the best I can. Am I happy? I think in general I'm happy. I'm happy with the career path I've chosen. I have a good family. I have a place to lay my head at night. I have a car, not the best car, but I have something to get me from A to B. I can't complain. There's always people worse off. It's easy to get down in the dumps and to complain and to feel like you have the worst life, but there's always people worse off than you. So in that sense, I'm happy that I just wake up every day, But at the same time, there's also things in my life that I can't control, and things that I can control that I need to fix with myself. I could work harder at school, or manage my money better, and in that sense, like I beat myself up over it, and so I'm not happy about that, and I let myself get stressed when I shouldn't. People always say, I just want to live a happy life. When I die, I want to say that I led a happy life, but I think it should be more like, are you content? Are you satisfied with the life you lived? Because your life is not always going to be happy. Things are going to happen. People, you're going to have family who dies, or different things that come up. But at the same time, you're going to always have great moments. But I just feel like, being satisfied is, can you accept the things that happen in your life and be okay with it? Can you accept that you're not going to have the best job, or you're not going to have a lot of money, but still be satisfied and be content with that? And so I think, in a sense, I'm satisfied with where I am in my life right now. I feel satisfied because I work hard, and like I said, I have a place to lay my head at night, so I'm satisfied. But down the road, there's always room for improvement also.
The universe is an absurd, indifferent, foreign, strange, and chaotic space of existence. It is with such characteristics that the universe is conceived without any purpose, without any design. The alienated human, as a responsible, belonging agent of being, burdened with the terrifying freedom to choose, is set adrift in such a universe, void of meaning. It is with this dizziness of freedom, the burden of choosing, that the human being must tragically face existential dread of his ultimate finite existence. Authentically, the human being would take on the challenging responsibility of his or her burden of choosing and act without any notion or sentiment of hope and anguish for the consequence of living. It is with this reaction to the world that the existential individual will create his or her essence into the world and embrace the absurdity of life, where he and she will find meaning in the meaninglessness.
Well, what is existentialism? I mean, it's always difficult to define any philosophy, and existentialism is much more difficult to define than others. And in fact, usually once you've defined, like as Nietzsche said, once you've defined something, you've removed it from history. So, to me, if you give a specific definition of existentialism, you're pretty much done with it. So it's really an evolving philosophy, and there's still a lot of work to be done in existentialism.
Well, one thing that I would point out is that I wouldn't attempt a definition right off the bat at existentialism, because existentialism is a word that categorizes a movement that really can't be categorized. So in many senses, it's not an ism at all, because if you look at roughly the people that would be called existentialists, since they each emphasize the human individual, their philosophies vary greatly. So it's pretty difficult to give a definition of existentialism. It's more of a movement.
Well, basically is not a way to describe anything. It is or it isn't, and that's pretty much the way actually I describe existentialism. It is a way of being. It's not necessarily a philosophical school of thought or anything. It's a choice that you make to make choices, that live your life by choices, that everything is your choice to make, and it is or it isn't in your life, and you decide from every morning that you wake up, and that's what existentialism is a way to live your life, not by a deity or not by someone else or by another agenda besides your own.
I always just kind of viewed it as responsibility for your own existence, trying to live as authentically and as true to yourself as possible amidst like all the chaos and the absurdity of life. I guess it gives kind of peace or something to life.
I like to think of it more as like a description of the way that the way that we necessarily exist, than like some school of philosophy or this way that some people think. It's recognizing the human condition, you know, that there is no ultimate appeal to anything else. There's no ultimate meaning. You know, everything falls back on you and your ability to choose. You can't trust, you know, there's no other authority. It's just you and the act of creation.
It's a philosophy of responsibility, a philosophy of freedom, in which because our existence came before our essence, we now have the responsibility to do whatever it is with our essence that we care to do.
Existentialism might be conceived of as a movement, not a sensibility, not a series of doctrines to be sure, something much more than a historical phase, something much more than just a period in recent philosophy, or something much more than simply a movement of the sort that one can label, stamp, can, and put on the shelf. It was Sartre himself who said, when he was asked about what is existentialism, he said that to try and define it is to freeze it. It's to treat it as no longer a living movement, but as something dead, something that can be simply classified.
Human beings exist as finite creatures, ultimately bound to death. So the emphasis is on individual existence, that human beings are born into the world, we are free, we are responsible for our actions, and that ultimately we have to face our destiny, which is death.
For me, all philosophies, I think, is the one that can give you the closest to finding the meaning of life, which is what a lot of philosophy, the goal of philosophy is to find that elusive meaning of life. But one thing that existentialism teaches us is that on the surface, life itself has no meaning a priori, but that the meaning can be placed upon life by the individual. I think that's the most important thing that existentialism teaches us.
Life is the meaning of life. It's not anything outside of life, and it's not even necessarily any particular content of life or way of life. It's just life itself.
Existentialism as a way of life, and as a lot of people look at it, it is something that you can apply. It's not exactly academia. It's more of the grassroots notion of, I wake up in the morning, I make my decisions, I go out and live my life. And I guess that's why it's so hard to look at existentialism is as a true way of philosophy, even in the classroom, is because you can't nail down what the specifics are, what the particulars are, anything like that. And it is more of nothing to live up to and everything to live up to for yourself.
Living with the knowledge that life is meaningless, you find that gives it more meaning. I mean, you don't waste your life worrying about the afterlife or worrying about tomorrow, when everything inside of you ought to reject it.
Existentialists do not attempt to build philosophical systems. They are anti-system building. And this is one of the reasons, like you point out, that the existentialists want to bring this way of thinking and acting, not just thinking but acting, into everyone's daily activities. And once again, to get back to what we said at the beginning, because the bottom line here is that human existence is an existence that is finite and mortal. And each one of us will eventually have to face our death. So you can have all the systems in the world that you want, but you're still going to have to go through that. One time Kierkegaard made the comment about Hegel that he built a beautiful philosophical mansion, but just like the rest of us, he had to live in a shack.
One can trace the movement as far back as one likes. I've often heard it traced back to Socrates, who, after all, said famously, "One should know thyself," and took great responsibility for his own behavior, defended the virtues, and was very much the individual. I've heard it traced back to Heraclitus, before Socrates, a philosopher who defended the impermeability of life and who often delighted in contradictions and dark sayings. I would say St. Augustine was sort of a proto-existentialist because, again, his confessions are so inward-looking and he's so concerned with the questions of who I am and what I'm to do. But for our purposes here, I'm going to restrict our attention to 5 figures. So when we talk about existentialism, I think it's very important not to try to pin it down too much to begin with, not to try and define it in terms of this or that doctrine or this or that set of beliefs, but rather I'd like you to keep your mind open and see what these various, very individualistic figures have to say about themselves and about life.
Existentialism as a philosophical movement emerged in 20th century literature and philosophy. However, it was foreshadowed most notably by 2 19th century thinkers, Danish theologian and philosopher Søren Kierkegaard and German philologist and philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, both whom are considered forefathers of the movement. The roots of existentialism began with Kierkegaard in the first half of the 19th century. He was very critical of G.W.F. Hegel's philosophical system of German idealism, which analyzed being and existence in what Kierkegaard believed was an abstract and impersonal way. Kierkegaard was concerned with the individual's subjective experience of what it is to exist as a human being, an essential question in existentialism. For Kierkegaard, the individual constantly has to choose what she or he is to become without recourse in the findings of science and philosophy. As a Christian theologian, Kierkegaard believed that the individual could have a religious faith in the face of an absurd world. Like all other existential thinkers after him, Søren Kierkegaard brought a profound narrative foundation to existential philosophy, but with a religious basis. As an influential figure within early continental philosophy, he was the first thinker to introduce core themes that eventually made up existential philosophical thought, such as alienation, the individual, subjectivity, freedom, dread, and the absurd. It eventually became known in existentialism with the notable works of other thinkers following Kierkegaard that such concepts like dread, boredom, alienation, the absurd, freedom, commitment, and nothingness are fundamental to human existence. One of the most profound works of Kierkegaard that contributed significantly to existential thought was his highly original and provocative interpretation of the binding of Isaac's story as told in the book of Genesis. According to the story, Abraham is commanded by God to sacrifice his only begotten son Isaac on Mount Moriah. Abraham, in obedience, sets out to obey God's command with faithful conviction. As Abraham draws his knife for the blood sacrifice of his son, an angel of God calls to him from heaven and tells him to not make the sacrifice. In doing so, the angel approves Abraham for his fear of God and his willing faith and obedience. Søren Kierkegaard sees Abraham as a knight of faith, a person who places complete faith in himself and God. Kierkegaard goes on to imply that it is in Abraham's decision to willingly sacrifice his beloved son upon a commandment that he believes is against God's will to kill, that all individuals must make as beings in an absurd world. Abraham, like every living human being, is faced with the burden to choose, and it is in choosing that he must make what Kierkegaard calls a leap of faith in fear and trembling. Abraham, in making the near fatal decision to kill his son, faces the absurd in its most sublime, and is radically alone to take on the responsibility of choosing. Kierkegaard notes that whatever decision Abraham is to make once down the mountain, Abraham cannot justify his decision to anyone, nor seek a meaning of his choice, or reason to his choice beyond himself.
There ends up being no rational reason why he should listen to God or why he should, why he should do what he says. There's no justification for killing his son. There's no moral justification. There's nothing. And so ultimately, it just ends up being he has to trust that it's the right thing to do.
Abraham took this ultimate leap of faith, just like we take leaps of faith every day with love, with our jobs, with whether or not things are going to work out, and it's our ultimate choice to decide, you know, I'm just going to do it.
The existentialists always emphasize human beings are always in a state of becoming. So this man who takes the leap of faith, or a woman who takes the leap of faith, must do so continually with every choice they're confronted with in their lives. And he called that person, he said that ideal, that's existentialist ideal, he called that the knight of faith, like a knight in shining armor.
Friedrich Nietzsche stands as one of the most misquoted and mischaracterized figures in the history of philosophy. Although most scholars are reluctant to call him an existentialist, Nietzsche has profoundly contributed to the core understanding of the existential philosophical outlook. Nietzsche's contribution to existentialism was the idea that human beings must accept that they are part of a material world, regardless of what else might exist. As part of this world, human beings must live as if there is nothing else beyond life. A failure to live, to take risks, Nietzsche notes, is a failure to realize human potential. He implies in his writing that the human being must live dangerously. Friedrich Nietzsche's views on morality, truth, fate, freedom, the will to power, and death have contributed significant concepts and ideas to the emerging existential movement. Unlike Kierkegaard, Nietzsche held deep opposition, if not repudiation, to religion, where he is quoted famously in remark, "God is dead." For him, many people use religion, especially Judeo-Christian teachings, as a crutch for avoiding decisive action. Here, Nietzsche, along with existential thinkers following him, held boldly that human beings are responsible for their existence and must face his or her mortality and do with it the most they can. In his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche highlights common existential themes in his philosophy, including the Übermensch and the will to power. The will to power, according to Friedrich Nietzsche, is the fundamental component of human nature, where everything the human being does is an expression of the will to power. It is a psychological analysis of all human action and is accentuated by self-overcoming and self-enhancement. Contrasted with living for procreation, pleasure, or happiness, the will to power is a summary of all human beings' struggle against his or her surrounding environment, as well as his or her reason for living in it. The Übermensch, in a similar dialectic, is the philosophical concept of Nietzsche that posits the goal for humanity to seek the desire for self-fulfillment, namely the tendency for the individual to become actualized in what he or she potentially is. In the book, the protagonist Zarathustra announces the Übermensch as a goal humanity can set for itself, similar to Abraham Maslow's top hierarchy of needs, self-actualization, in which the key notion is for the human individual to make of himself or herself in a world where he or she is free to choose.
Throughout Nietzsche's works, there is, without a doubt, the assertion of value. Nietzsche is defending values. He says we can't live without values, and there is one value which has absolute status, and that is the value of life itself. Now, what he means by this is something that has to be interpreted in a number of different ways. It doesn't just mean survival is the only important thing. Quite to the contrary, there are many things more important than survival for the sake of life. But what works as a theme throughout all of Nietzsche's works, and what explains his rather rabid attacks on Christianity and religion in general, is the attack on what he calls the otherworldly, the idea of some other existence which is better than this one. Nietzsche's philosophy is very much a philosophy of aggressive acceptance, acceptance of this world, acceptance of yourself, acceptance of your faith. And, for example, the Christian notion of the other world, the heaven to which we can aspire, is to him a notion that utterly subtracts from the importance of this world and this life. The truth of it is, God is dead in the sense that we don't believe in him anymore, even if we claim to. But contrary to Kierkegaard's aspiration, which is to reinvent and reinvigorate Christianity in his own terms, Nietzsche would just as soon be done with it. And God is dead then also becomes a kind of statement about the future of the modern world. In one of his best and most encompassing books, The Gay Science, he has a madman appear in the marketplace who announces not only God is dead, but we have killed him. And interesting, the people who there watch him with amusement actually laugh at him, make fun of him, say, where is God? He got lost. What happened to him? But of course, the point is that God is dead in our world, and nevertheless, we are yet incapable of understanding what we have done.
Die Aufgabe, die dem Denken gestellt ist heute, wie ich es verstehe, ist in einer Weise neu, dass es eine ganz neue Methode des Denkens verlangt. Dieses Denken ist in der Sache sehr viel einfacher als die Philosophie, aber im Vollzug sehr viel schwieriger und verlangt eine neue Sorgfalt der Sprache.
As the movement of existentialism began to take fold in 20th century continental philosophy, German philosopher Martin Heidegger established an unprecedented influence on the tenets of the existential philosophy. Heidegger based his philosophy upon what he called the hermeneutics of existence, or the science of existence. This scientific method on the topic of existentialism was that of phenomenological reductionism. Heidegger's 1927 book, Being and Time, considered by many to be one of the most influential books of 20th century philosophy, provided an important discourse on existential thought. With a deep interest in metaphysics, Martin Heidegger treated the question of what is being as the most important question in philosophy. He claims that Western philosophy, traditionally throughout history, prejudicially overlooked the question and asserted that the question was treated as overly general, undefinable, and obvious. Continuing the philosophical method of phenomenology as begun by his former teacher, Edmund Husserl, Heidegger helped bridge phenomenology with existentialism and made it in many ways theoretically foundational and central to the movement itself. According to Heidegger, the human being, as opposed to human beings, is comprised of four components: concern, being toward death, existence, and moods. Dasein, what Heidegger famously coined, is the act of being there in essence. Thus, without being something, there is no existence. Dasein is the German vernacular term for existence and represents the being in the world, that is, constituted by its temporality, illuminated and interpreted by the being in time. Heidegger sought to define being with a capital B that establishes absolute existence in a complete or perfect state, lacking no essential characteristics, the essence of existing. He did not treat being with a lowercase b, signifying the fact of existing. At some point in the development process as a human being matures, a being becomes aware that it exists. This pivotal moment in time is when essence begins to take form and the individual decides to acknowledge and embrace an essence at that particular moment. This understanding of existence and essence, something Jean-Paul Sartre will later popularize, gets its early connotation in Heidegger's work. In Heidegger's writing, he establishes that because man is the only known being in the universe in which essence and existence do not appear simultaneously, man is a unique creature on this planet. All things man creates have essence or definition before they exist. In other words, an individual thinks about a creation and its purpose before the creation exists. Although life is filled with the dread that the universe is not safe and the guilt that life is never complete, the human being has a desire to exist and define the self. This point here is critical for Heidegger's phenomenology. The pursuit of authenticity, or the burden of choosing freely, is constant for the existentialist. While it cannot be perfected as we coexist with other beings, individuals must work to define themselves without any hope of intrinsic value outside an essence of the human being itself.
And the way I would describe Heidegger's project in terms of authenticity is something more like this. There's a choice we have to make, and Heidegger does describe it as a choice between authenticity and inauthenticity. But inauthenticity, if what I just said has any correctness, inauthenticity is something which is inferior, just going along with the crowd, living only in the eyes of others, just being what other people expect you to be, is, in some sense, an inferior mode of existence. But the alternative, authenticity, taking hold of yourself in this kind of very individualistic way that Kierkegaard and Nietzsche both praise. The notion of authenticity, or again to use the German notion Eigentlichkeit, is taking hold of ourselves. It's thinking about ourselves in a certain way, or more accurately, Heidegger would say, comporting ourselves, behaving ourselves in a certain way. To understand how this way is to be defined, let's look at three of the essential features of Dasein that Heidegger outlines. In fact, he calls these existentials as a way of emphasizing that they are essential aspects of our existence. The first of them is called existence. And here Heidegger is harking back to Kierkegaard with his very special notion of existence, the idea that human beings don't just exist the way a coffee cup exists or the way a tree exists, but human beings have the capacity for a very special kind of existence which involves, among other things, appreciating who you are. Not so much reflection in the abstract theoretical sense, but rather reflection in the sense of being ontological, asking basic questions about your own existence. Heidegger says that existence, in some sense, precedes the notion of essence here, that the notion of essence, how we think about ourselves as particular individuals and so on, is something that follows from, doesn't precede, our notion that we are, first of all, existing creatures, question-asking creatures, creatures who, in a way, have to take hold of ourselves. It's within the context of existence that Heidegger says Dasein has possibilities.
The French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, considered the most written about 20th century philosopher, came onto the world scene with his famous 1946 lecture entitled Existentialism is Humanism. It is mainly through the work of Jean-Paul Sartre that the existential movement was brought to the attention of a wide international audience, especially in the United States. In the lecture, Sartre begins to define existentialism with the simple axiom that existence precedes essence. This simply means that man first is, and only subsequently is this or that. For Jean-Paul Sartre, man must create his own essence. It is in throwing himself into the world, suffering there, struggling there, that he gradually defines himself. And the definition always remains open-ended. We cannot say what this man is before he dies, or what mankind is before it has disappeared. In the lecture he implies, what do we mean by saying that existence precedes essence? We mean that man first of all exists, encounters himself, searches up in the world, and defines himself afterwards. If man as the existentialist sees himself as not definable, it is because to begin with he is nothing. He will not be anything until later, and then he will be what he makes of himself. Thus there is no human nature, because there is no God to have a conception of it. Man simply is. Not that he is simply what he conceives himself to be, but he is what he wills. And as he conceives himself after already existing, as he wills to be after that leap towards existence. Man is nothing else but that which he makes of himself. That is the first principle of existentialism.
That essay probably did more than anything else to introduce existentialism to the lay world. This was an essay that was written for the non-scholar. It was written for the public consumption. And it probably did more than anything else to spread existentialism, because Sartre was a persuasive writer, and in this essay he says, well, there's a lot of misunderstandings about what existentialism is. I'm going to have as my sole purpose of this essay just to explain what people mean by existentialism.
As a social and literary critic, he really figureheads this movement for personal responsibility, for taking accountability for your life, to be authentic with what you do and not pawn off the accountability for your actions on superlunary forces like God, or in large part psychology.
Sartre based existentialism on free will, where individuals are free from the moment of conception and define their essence throughout their existence by such freedom. With numerous fictional works from short stories like The Wall, novels like Nausea and The Age of Reason, and plays like The Flies and No Exit, to even non-fiction works like The Transcendence of the Ego and Being and Nothingness, Sartre, throughout his career as a public intellectual, was able to convey and expound on important elements of existentialism. Such elements included phenomenology and ontology, analyzing what it is to be a human being, conception of freedom as the ultimate aim of human existence, the condemnation to be free in an absurd universe, the human condition in the face of existential dread and angst, and a defined human consciousness as an act of negation with what he calls a transcendence of the given world. All theoretical concepts that help define and establish existentialism as a serious subject matter in its own right, in intellectual circles, and a practical philosophy for everyday life. Albert Camus comes at the latter stages of the existentialism movement and contributes greatly to existentialism with his writings and literature. His two novels, The Stranger and The Plague, stand as classical works of existential thought. The Stranger, one of the most well-known novels of the 20th century, conveys one of the best examples of the absurdity of human existence in a different universe. In the story, the protagonist is prosecuted for a murder crime. At the trial, the prosecution calls him a remorseless killer, and the protagonist is convicted and then awaits his execution. In the prison cell, he accepts his fate because it's the only real option he has left. Neither suicide nor faith are options once the tragic hero of this novel fully realizes the absurdity of the world in which he lives. Another theme in the novel is destiny, where Camus suggests that people are responsible for their actions and the consequences of those actions, a major tenet to existentialism. His later novel, The Plague, asks a number of questions relating to the nature of destiny and the human condition, when the narrator throughout the novel emphasizes the ideas that individuals ultimately have no control. Irrationality of life is inevitable, and conscious human beings must react toward the absurd. The Plague represents how the world deals with the philosophical notion of the absurd, a theory which Camus himself helped to define. Clearly, the absurd, a notion first began by Søren Kierkegaard and lightly touched upon by later existential thinkers, is something that profoundly moves the Nobel Prize laureate, and is something Albert Camus expounded on heavily. For Camus, the most important question in philosophy, and perhaps life itself, is the question of suicide. Throughout his essays, Camus presented his readers with such dualisms like happiness and sadness, dark and light, life and death. His aim was to emphasize the fact that happiness is fleeting and that the human condition is one of mortality. Camus comes across these issues of dualism with the paradox. We value our lives and existence so greatly, but at the same time we know we will eventually die and ultimately our endeavors are meaningless. While we can live with the dualism that I can accept periods of unhappiness because I know I will also experience happiness to come, we cannot live with the paradox that I think my life is of great importance and I also think it is meaningless. Albert Camus was interested in how people experience the absurd and how people live and eventually cope with it. For him, life must have meaning for one to value it. If we accept that life has no meaning and therefore no value, shouldn't we kill ourselves? His best work with the notion of the absurd comes in the story of the myth of Sisyphus.
Well, the myth of Sisyphus can be viewed as an allegory. Sartre certainly thought of it as an allegory, as looking at, say, the typical working class individual that goes throughout their day doing the same menial task day in and day out. It's very much like Sisyphus in the Greek story. One would think that Sisyphus should definitely see that there's a meaninglessness in this task.
Sisyphus was a character in Greek mythology. He was condemned by the gods to a truly pointless task. He had to roll a rock up a mountain, and of course when it got to the top, it would roll down of its own weight, and he would have to do it again and again and again and again. This is a kind of symbol of what Camus refers to famously as the absurd. And he points out in his retelling of the story of Sisyphus that one can't think of anything more absurd than a lifetime filled with futile labor. Now, the notion of the absurd is a special notion. It's not particularly technical. The absurd is really a metaphysical thesis. It's, to put it very bluntly, it's a confrontation. It is a confrontation between the rational human mind, the mind that deserves and demands justice, that expects the universe to be comprehensible, and what Camus calls, in a phrase that he borrows straight from The Stranger, an indifferent universe. The truth is, the world doesn't care. The absurd is this recognition that we have a demand of the world, and the world just doesn't care. But the idea that death leads to the absurd gives rise to another consideration too, that there's a sense in which we expect our lives to add up to something. And as Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament tells us quite bluntly, this is the vanity of vanities. It doesn't. And what Sisyphus and Ecclesiastes both give us is a picture of life where we have all of our aspirations and ambitions, our joys and our achievements, but ultimately, in the end, it amounts to nothing. That's the absurd. There's a sense in which justification runs out. So too in science. Understanding runs out. Understanding the universe, contrary to the view of a great many Enlightenment philosophers, will never ultimately give us satisfaction. Because the truth is, the absurd is with us. The absurd is this confrontation between our rational demands and the indifferent universe. And within that context, reason itself becomes a problem. Now, going back to the Sisyphus story itself, I think one should ask, how does Sisyphus cope with the absurd? Camus makes it very clear in his telling of the story that Sisyphus is what he calls the absurd hero. And while we might readily agree that his situation is absurd, what is it that makes him a hero? Well, the Sisyphus story might be interpreted in two different ways. And Camus gives us hints towards each. The first interpretation, which I think is very close to Camus' best thinking, is this. He says, in language which is a bit archaic and amusing now, that Sisyphus makes his rock his thing. He puts himself into his labor. And one can imagine Sisyphus, as he rolls the rock up the mountain, coming to notice, appreciate, and even love the various contours and markings on the rock itself. He comes to study and appreciate and even become very fond of the various bumps and levels that the rock has to proceed along. There's a sense in which what he does is he throws himself into his labor. And the consequence of this, Camus tells us, is that Sisyphus must be considered happy. When he simply throws himself into his work and says, this is what I do, and I'm not going to think about the fact that in the end of eternity, it's added up to nothing. The second answer that Camus gives us is a bit more difficult to stomach. It's the idea that Sisyphus takes on his task because he has to, but he does it with resentment. He resents the gods who have so condemned him. And there's an irony here, of course, because Camus is an atheist and wants to ask what the gods are doing there. But the basic idea is that what keeps Sisyphus afloat, what keeps him feeling that his life is meaningful, is that he shakes his fist at the gods as he is doing his task with, as Camus tells us, scorn and defiance. In other words, resentment. Sisyphus rebels, but what's interesting is he doesn't do what we would expect him to do as a member of his own labor union, and that is to drop the rock and refuse to push it any further. He continues to push the rock. It's his fate. But as he does it, he rebels in the sense that he refuses to accept the absurdity that has been imposed upon him by the gods.
Well, we see when we're faced with the absurd, and this is a primary motif of the myth of Sisyphus, is that while we have no reason to go on, which we don't, no reason from the outside anyway, we have no reason to continue living, we have no reason to continue being, but at the same time, we have no reason to give up. We have absolutely no reason to kill ourselves. We're stuck here in a meaningless world. And finally, we are free to enjoy the pure exuberance of life.
We are condemned to be free. Freedom is a burden. It's a very dreadful burden to assume when we're talking about the individual being responsible for the choices they've made in their lives and being responsible for the fact that they have to define who they are.
Just existing is saying that there's something worth existing for.
Existentialism isn't saying kill yourself, isn't saying that life's worthless. It's, if anything, I think it's the most beautiful philosophical school of thought, because it's, you know, it's like, yes, life is meaningless. Yes, there is no meaning. It's absurd. It's finite. You know, you die tomorrow or whatever. But I think that's what makes it all the more important. And people miss that, and people miss out that the struggle is the beauty of life. The struggle is what makes it worth. The fact that you can climb up to the top of that mountain every time, knowing full well the rock is just going to tumble down behind you, but you just keep going. And at that moment that you've realized you've beaten the absurd, that you've remained genuine, that is the most beautiful experience in life.
I believe the difference between a job and a career is that a job you just get for the money. You're just there just to work through the day, take home your paycheck. A career is something that you want to do, something that you're there because you like what you're doing. I seriously believe that a lot of people are just doing whatever they're doing just because they have to or because they think they have to. And I've run into quite a few people who believe that if you're working, then you can't like it. Or the flip side, you know, if you like what you're doing, it's not work. And that just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, if you like what you're doing and you're working, then I don't see the problem in that. If I'm just looking for a job just for money, I do need some passion in what I'm doing, otherwise I won't like it. I mean, I've had examples in the past where I'll do something and just flat out hate it and not stay there very long, even though I may need the money. If I'm, you know, in my career, then that's really important. That's, you know, passion is something that I definitely need. My actual job title is producer-director. I try not to do much producing. I try to stay behind the camera and you know, I do a lot of directing, I do some editing. I've always been interested in television, but I never really wanted to get into it until I guess it was back in 2004. I graduated from UWF in 2002 with an accounting degree, and the few months before that was 9/11, Enron, Arthur Andersen, all those other companies that went belly up. So I was having some problems finding a position somewhere, and so I wound up working at the Haas Center on campus, and I decided that that wasn't something I wanted to keep doing. So, you know, I had an interest in TV, so I took classes and got a second bachelor's degree, and then I was invited to work here. Television production appealed to me because of the creative aspect of the job or the career. It's, you know, you're making something every time you have a camera on, every time you're editing something, you're creating something. What is the purpose of life? Well, I think one way of answering the question, what's the purpose of life, is to basically go about it by the biological idea that we're here to procreate. We're here to make more of ourselves. Philosophically, that's a really hard question to answer. I mean, you could say that you're here to improve things, or to improve yourself, or to better the world. I honestly don't know the answer to that question. My motivation in the morning has changed over the last few years. Now it's really not knowing what's going to happen when I get to work, and that's actually kind of exciting. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I had a job a few years ago where I knew exactly what was going to happen every day, and you know, I showed up and, you know, just went into what I had to do, and it was almost the exact same thing every time I was there, and it was very boring, and I didn't stay there very long. But when I come here in the morning, I get here and I see what's happening, and then I go from there, and that's what keeps me excited. I think the way people view money it's that it really does affect their lives way too much. I mean, and I wouldn't really say it's about money. It's more about status. You know, they feel if they have more money, they'll be able to buy more stuff, and they'll look better in the eyes of their neighbors. And to me, I honestly don't care if my neighbors think. I mean, you know, if I have the money to do what I want, then everything's fine. And you know, if my neighbors have more than I do, well, that's them. I think society likes to have people be like everyone else, which doesn't really help people be themselves. I mean, everyone has probably had issues where, you know, a group wants to do something and they don't want to do it, but they go along with it anyway because the group's doing it and they don't want to rock the boat. To me, death is the end of life. I mean, I really don't think too much beyond that. And if you dwell on death, then it's really going to affect your life probably in a negative way. But if you just figure, well, I'll find out when I get there, then, you know, it's just another phase.
Existence precedes essence. Now, this is very important, because up until the time of the existentialists, most philosophers in the Western world had believed that essence precedes existence. You find it in Plato, you find it in Descartes, the father of modern philosophy. That is, that there is a predetermined design, especially in the case of the human soul, that we, in the case of the Greeks, we, in their self-realization view, that we try to realize. Well, Sartre rejected this completely. And he says that you are like an actor that is thrown on the stage, and that's when you're born. And you are responsible to define yourself, that there is no predetermined destiny or end or meaning that's given before birth. It is up to you to make what you are. There is no absolute standard for meaning. That's why, once again, meaning is our responsibility. You're on the stage. That stage is real. You have to act on it. And it's going to be up to you how you decide to act.